Hello friends, welcome to another episode of the Riflechair channel. Today we're outside during another weather warning. You know, it's highly recommended. People should not be driving today. We've got huge full factor winds going, sideways snow, and we got snow dunes popping up all over the place. And I figured it was a perfect time to go outside and make a video. Now, unfortunately, there's going to be a little bit of wind, so I've got the microphone deep down inside my my clothing here. So hopefully you can hear this. What I'm standing on here is an anti-aircraft foundation. It's a wide circular foundation, and I'd made a previous video on this site a little while ago during a rainstorm. Is one of the things that we have to get used to up here is the weather. But this here is an anti-aircraft foundation that was built here by around 1943 in North Coast, British Columbia, in a town which I'm in right now called Terrace, British Columbia, which is not too far from Alaska. Now, this whole area was built up to be a defensive position for what was expected could be a Japanese invasion. So there were about 3,000 soldiers from 4 different regiments from across Canada. They became the, I think it was in February 1943, 3,000 soldiers arrived at this location in a small town, a small hick town in the middle of a forest that had 300 people living in it. So you can try to imagine 3,000 soldiers suddenly arrive here on a train, and there's nowhere for them to live. There's no infrastructure. They have to start building defensive positions for what they thought could be a Japanese invasion. Now add on top of that another 3,000 members of the Royal Canadian Engineers and contractors. They came into this town and started building it up. So they built this huge area up, and they built our airport, and the War Measures Act beefed it up. They had built little fortifications like this here for anti-aircraft guns, which I thought might have been a Bofors 40 millimeter position, but thanks to one of my subscribers out there, they were correcting me. This thing, what I'm standing on here, is probably a 3.7 inch anti-aircraft gun. And this thing would have, it's a big heavy piece, over 20,000 pounds. They probably would have had this built up for a big heavy anti-aircraft gun that's going to be able to take out Japanese planes, bombers, exceedingly high elevations. We're talking over 30,000 feet. This thing would be able to pump a 28-pound shell, high fragmentary rounds, very similar in many respects to the German 88 flak guns that they used against us in the Western Europe over Germany. Well, one of those guns was located on this pad. And I want to thank Charles from Australia for bringing this to my attention, that this is not a Bofors foundation. It's probably a 3.7 inch gun. And what he explained to me, this Australian chap, Charles, he was, shit. Camera just got blown over. I've already lost one camera because of wind here, and I don't want to lose another. So I've repositioned the wind behind one of these concrete pillars here, and we'll refocus again. So a 3.7 inch gun. This thing is able to lob a 28-pound shell 30 to 45,000 feet in the air. That seems to be kind of the maximum height. That is a tremendously high altitude. And so, but in these kind of conditions, pretty unlikely that they're going to need anything that high. I mean, honestly, during World War II, one of the biggest enemies they had in this area was the weather. If you do some reading on how these men had to contend with the weather, there were a lot of aircraft that we lost. They got lost in the clouds, or the wind was just too great. They couldn't navigate their way back to the airport, and they had a ditch. And we lost a lot of good men because of the weather. So anyway, 3.7 inch gun. It's got to be over 20,000 pounds of steel, lobbing these massive shells up into the air in defense of Canada and the United States. Canadians. Now, just over here, towards Prince Rupert, there were a bunch of Americans too. A lot of Americans. Now, they were there to spearhead a lot of the defense for Alaska and North Coast British Columbia from the Japanese invasion. There were observation posts and all these coastal island groups. There were submarine nets. There were artillery, reinforced artillery positions all along the North Coast, all with a view to defending against an a Pacific Japanese invasion. I mean, for all intended purposes, the islands of Kodiak, Kisku, and Attu of the Aleutian Islands had been occupied by the Japanese. Pearl Harbor had occurred. The Americans had entered into the war, and it was, get ready. We're getting ready. I mean, if the Japanese did decide to dump 50, 60,000 men into this area, there wouldn't be a heck of a lot to oppose them. So in 1943, in February, the Canadian Army brought 3,000 soldiers and dumped them here in Terrace with a view to defending against a large coastal invasion from Japan. On top of that, another 3,000 Royal Canadian Engineers and contractors were brought in to basically build this into a defensive position. And they had to contend with weather just like this. Just like this. 21 months later, something kind of unique happened in Canadian military history, and I'll get into that in a minute. Now you can imagine what it would take to build the infrastructure to house 3,000 to 6,000 people in an area that only had 300 people living in it. This was a hick town. There wasn't much more here than a few farms and a very small logging industry. I better cover up. I'm going to get friggin' frostbite here. Excuse me. Well, we got weather warnings. They didn't have that. Kind of infrastructure to help them determine what day-to-day is going to look like. This is kind of a commonplace occurrence up here. I'm just going to turn away from the wind. So, they were the 15th Canadian Infantry Brigade. There were 3,000 men from the 1st Battalion Fusiliers du Saint-Laurent, Quebec, the Prince Edward Island Highlanders, the Prince Albert Volunteers, and the 19th Canadian Field Ambulance. One of the things that they built here in this area, because we have, well, lots of mountains, is they turned Terrace into the mountain warfare school. So if you want to know how to conduct war in mountains, this is the kind of place you'd come and you'd get trained up. They arrived February 26, 1943 and started getting to work. So they built huge infrastructure. They built H huts to house the men. They built a parade square. They had all of the infrastructure they needed in order to maintain this defensive position. They built the airport. 21 months later, a whole bunch of them mutinied. Now, why would they do that? And you have to kind of think about the situation of these men. And they came into this area, which is pretty remote. There was nothing up here. My camera's going to fall over. There's pretty much nothing up here. And so you can imagine what the morale may have been like. I mean, you're going to be sitting on your gun position like I am right here, right now, day in, day out. You know, a year goes by. And it's pretty quiet. You know, what kind of happens up here when you're confronted with environmentals like this? There's nowhere to really vent off steam. I mean, sure, they got a beautiful rifle range they built. The Royal Canadian Engineers came in. They built a huge 500-yard military range with mounds every 100 yards. And they even had concrete rifle butts, which are still there today. In my opinion, it should be a historical site. But I mean, there's only so much you can do. There's nowhere to. These are young men. I mean, there's no girls. I mean, the local population isn't very friendly to them. for various reasons. Because, well, if you're part of a small family and you're trying to raise a family and you've got 3,000 to 6,000 men, you're going to want to be taking care of your daughters. So, November 25th, 1944, they've been here for 21 months living like this. And they get noticed that they're going to be sent overseas. In November 1944, the War of the Pacific had pretty much almost been determined. There's some critical battles that occurred in the Pacific thanks to the U.S. Navy. It really had helped to try to take care of a lot of those concerns of a Pacific Japanese invasion into North Coast, British Columbia, and Alaska. So that threat was reduced. So the war in Europe had definitely ramped up, and resources and men were required. So they were notified that they were going to Europe to fight against Germany. Well, the units that were put here in Terrace at the time were considered to be home defense units. When conscription was brought in 1942, I believe it was. I'm worried my camera is going to get blown over. Large numbers of Canadians across the entire nation were pretty unhappy about that, and a lot of them would riot. There were protests, especially in Quebec, where they refused. Absolutely not. They're not going over to Europe. They're not going to go fight the British War, which is what they considered it at the time. Even though it was France that was occupied, it was the British War, right? That's just plain ignorance. Sorry, guys, I got a cold. And dummy me out here in weather like this. But if I waited for the weather to get good, I'd never leave the house. So, what happened is the day after they discovered they were going to be shipped out to Europe, they mutinied, and it was the largest mutiny in Canadian history. It was mostly the Quebecers, also known as the what do they call them? They had a name for them. It'll come back to me. Zombies. They were called the zombies. Excuse me. And they mutinied. They actually they took 50,000 rounds of .303 British ammunition, 15,000 rounds of 9mm Sten gun ammunition. They raided the weapons storage facility, and they held their officers and NCOs at gunpoint. Seriously. And the largest mutiny in Canadian military history, and nobody knows about it. Happened here in this town. Now, they did manage to sort it out. There was a large leadership convention going on in Vancouver Island at the time, so the higher officers weren't even here. They were down in Vancouver Island when this occurred, and they did manage to eventually sort it out. And all of the NCOs that were involved in that were basically removed of their rank. There was large attempts of trying to get out of this area on the railway, and they were turned back at gunpoint, sent back to barracks, and confined. But they did manage to take care of the mutiny and quell it without having to fire a single shot. I guess that's where you're dealing with difficult people skills come in, and whatnot, threatening them with sedition. Nobody knows about this. So we have in this town a celebration every single year. It's called Skeena Riverboat Days, because a lot of the history of this area was we were supplied on the river in the Skeena by riverboats. You know, the paddle wheelers, the stern wheelers, and big river. That's how you got resupplied. It was by boat, not by railway, back in the day. And but I think that we should have, instead of Skeena Riverboat Days, we should have Mutiny Days. It's historically it's a big deal here in Terrace. A lot of the areas that you have here in this town were built because of World War II. I mean, this pad here, it's still here from World War II. This 3.7-inch anti-aircraft gun. There's bomb shelters up at the airport. There's a military range. There's remnants of the H-Huts, the original H-Huts, and our Branch 13 of the Royal Canadian Legion is the quartermaster store from World War II. A lot of the original infrastructure that was built here is still here, and people walk by it every day. They don't realize it or see it for what it is. It's seriously cool, and a lot of these sites should be preserved. Anyway, that's just a really short video for you guys here, and hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to get out of this weather and have a cup of coffee. I think that's what I'm going to do. Hope you're all doing well. Cheers, and as always, make believe out.